right, let's go ahead and get started. Let me figure out where my slides went. All right, hopefully everyone had a good weekend. Welcome to our third class. So today is pretty exciting. We're gonna move a little bit away from being in Google Analytics so heavily today and focus a lot on how to get the data into GA and different types of data that's just really important to really be able to use the product effectively. So today's all about custom dimensions, custom metrics, calculated metrics, event tracking, and then really putting it all together. So just a few reminders. Said this in the first two lectures, but the class on Wednesday has been rescheduled to 4/24. I'm going to be at the Conversion XL conference. Hope to see a few of you there. If you are, definitely send me a message on LinkedIn or by email. Would love to meet up. But that class will be rescheduled for later in April. Just a reminder about the Q&A feature. While tempting, don't use that. Instead, if you could just use the chat feature and make sure you chat your question to everyone. The reason why we share that chat log after to people who are watching it, and it's just helpful to have those documented. As always, we have plenty of time for Q&A after this class. Really encourage you guys to bring questions, anything you want help with Google Analytics. It doesn't even have to be related to the lecture. It's open Q&A time for you guys to use however you want. And we've only used about 15 minutes of it in the first two lectures. So definitely encourage you to use whatever you need. And if you remember anything, or in case you're watching this as a recorded user, we do have that Facebook group. And I definitely, trying to engage as much as possible. So use that for everything in between classes. And as always, question and feedback is appreciated. So as mentioned, the agenda for today, we're going to start off by going over event tracking. So events are how we record basically every non-page interaction. So you can't use Google Analytics, and it's not going to tell you an accurate story of your business if you don't know how to use events. So that's where we're going to start. And events are important because then they build on the rest of today's lecture. Custom dimensions, how we track custom metadata about our users, our sessions, our page, our content. Custom metrics, it's a better version of event values. And then calculated metrics, where we can start to define our own ratios and our own calculations. And at the end, I'm excited to share a little bit about putting it all together. You guys kind of a sneak peek of Data Studio and some report that really makes everything kind of show and connect nicely. So just as a reminder, there is a demo account. Please make sure you guys have access to that. That's how we follow along. You can see everything I do. But today, you might want to actually use your own Google Analytics account. We're going to have an exercise later in the lecture to create some calculated metrics together. And you're going to need Collaborator or higher access to do that. So you'll either need to create a brand new property view or use one you maybe already have. And I'll go over that later in the lecture. All right, so we're going to dive right in today. Didn't really have much of a GA 101 refresher for this one, but we're going to go over pretty much everything about event tracking, and I'll show you guys some examples of how this works as well. So I've lectured on this a few different times before, but when we take a look at a website, so if we look at my own website or someone else's, when we kind of look at what rates someone from a beginner to an intermediate or advanced user, this is definitely one of the things I look at. So the recommended implementation of Google Analytics is to simply go in, you grab your tracking code out of the admin, it's one script of code, and you put it on every single page across your website. And that's great, it's gonna give you some aggregate data. But for me, when I'm kind of auditing or assessing someone's data maturity, one of the first things I look at is that the only thing that this website or this particular user I'm talking to has done? Because I can pretty much tell right away if your website only contains page views, which means you've just put that tracking code on every single page. I know that you're more of a beginner and you don't really know how to customize Google Analytics correctly. And that's where event tracking and these custom dimensions and metrics come in, and they're so important. So I'm going to go over, I think, a lot of use cases. But first, let's just start off with a high-level definition of what an event is. So I copied and pasted this directly from the support page, which there's a link to in another slide. Events are user interactions with content, that can be tracked independently from web page or screen load. That's all you really need to know. So what an event is it's effectively a type of data, and we can actually call it a hit in Google Analytics. So there's different hit types, which are different interactions we can track. So page views are one hit type. Events are another hit type. They're not page views. They're other types of interactions. And in this use case, an event is simply any interaction that's not a page. And we'll talk about some of the other hit types later on. But those two hit types, in addition to e-commerce, are the only hit types that you really ever need to know or use. So these events are super important. We use this in Google Analytics to track everything that happens after a page load. So maybe we can go to a few websites and think about why these events are so important, right? So if I'm a beginner user to Google Analytics and I'm trying to track content engagement as an example, the way Google Analytics works is when I load this page, hopefully in the head, so right away it's page view. And then what's going to happen is after that page view is recorded, the user is then going to interact with this page, at least hopefully interact with this page. So they're going to, for example, start scrolling on the page. They might start clicking on the share button to share with Facebook. And as I mentioned, if all you did was put Google Analytics on every page, you cannot measure the effectiveness of this page. So there's a few very important things to know. First is, let's talk about bounce rate. So if you remember, the definition of a bounce rate is a single page visit. It's users that come to this page and then they leave without doing anything. And the way Google Analytics tracks a bounce by default is between those page views. So if you're tracking a blog as an example, it's highly likely the user can be super engaged with this post and meet all of the objectives that you had for this. And Google Analytics is still gonna track it as a bounce. And worse yet, it's also important to note, most people don't know this, but the way time is calculated in Google Analytics. So time, like time on page or time on site, is calculated between interactions, which means that for this particular blog post, or if I go to a better one, maybe we go to one that has way more content. So I blogged about 5 attribution questions you can answer with GA. And I like to get fairly technical. So sometimes my posts can get fairly long. And I might have a user that comes in, reads this, clicks on some of the other pages to get more context. But if all I have is page views tracked on this particular page, then there's actually no time associated with it. Meaning if that user came to this page, scrolled, read, and did everything for 15 minutes and then closed, it's recorded as one page, it's recorded as a bounce, and it's recorded as 0 time on site and 0 session duration. So this right here starts to really elaborate on why events are going to be so important. So we can use events heavily, for example, for blogs. So we can use events to track scrolling. So some people like to track scrolling by percentage of a page, 25, 50, 75, 100. Other of my clients like to track it by milestones. So you can, for example, start it at content start, you can track one at the middle, and you can track one when they get to the bottom of the content. We can talk about some pros and cons of those two approaches in a minute. These social shares, by default, Google Analytics doesn't track those. So you need events to track share intents. You need events to track comments. You need events to track videos. You need events to track outbound links. But all of these types of events allow us to really track how much and how our users are interacting with this post. So I can actually go in and do analysis and determine, are my pages too long? Are they too short? Is my content not resonating with my users? You can start to get at some of that assessment through events. So let's talk a little bit more about what an event is and what's required. So there's a developer article that I linked here where you can read 3 pages worth of everything you need to know about events, but it's really pretty simple. So an event, again, is a type of hit in Google Analytics, and there's 4 fields, and really only 3 that you ever need to know about. There's an event category, there's an event action, there's an event label, and then there's an event value. And you can see here that the category and action are required. So you can just think of this as a hierarchy, right? There's a category. When you click on it, it'll show you the action. When you click on that, it'll show you the label associated with the action that you drilled in on. So it's kind of like that pyramid, right? And the event value is an optional field where you can attach an integer or a decimal associated with it. So with that, for example, if you wanted to track add to carts, the old way of add to carts was to use the event value to track the cart options. And I said that these are not useful because custom metrics, which is a new feature, it didn't exist when a value was first announced, has really replaced all the use cases for ever using an event. So I personally almost never use those, and instead I'll use custom metrics. So you don't really ever need to use that. We'll talk about that more in a minute. So when we send an event, what's important here, just like when we talked about campaigns and traffic sources, I mentioned and talked about that the naming conventions was the most important part, right? So if you don't have good naming conventions for what you call a channel and what you call a source, and half of your team is calling Facebook and using a medium of social, and the other half is using social-media, and then the other random part is actually using a source of social and the medium of Facebook, it makes those reports useless and no one can really use those. So this is the same process for events. It is really important. And when I work with clients like the vast majority of time that I'm working as kind of an analyst, or when I'm building the requirements of something on a page, I spend more time probably on thinking through naming conventions than I do on actually implementing the event themselves. So I have a spreadsheet and I really think through what should the data look like for these category actions and labels. So we're gonna go a little bit into the developer mindset of what you actually need to implement an event in Google Analytics. Here is how you would use universal analytics, meaning if you've hard-coded Google Analytics on every page, you can see it's pretty simple to send an event. You simply add some JavaScript, you have a hit type of an event, and then you define the category, action, and label. And I highly encourage you, if you have hard-coded universal analytics, you should definitely either take a look at the other Conversion Excel course for Google Tag Manager, or just get started yourself. All of these events, interactions, page views, everything you're doing with Google Analytics should be tracked through a tag management system. But this is just illustrating how you would use it to use the hard-coded GA or the universal library. So I'm going to show an example in a little bit about how to do this with universal analytics. And Kylie, you asked, what if we use GA and WordPress plugin? Well, my website right here, my blog, is WordPress. I made this in WordPress. My favorite plugin is the Duracell plugin. It's the Google Tag Manager extension. And you just simply install it and you put in a GTM ID and it's installed for you. Super easy. And better yet, when I get the custom dimensions, I'm actually going to show you what that free plugin actually does from a custom dimension perspective, which would be really good. But basically, if you're using any sort of templated site that's hosted, for example, WordPress, there's always plugins that will exist for those to make it easy for you to implement. All right, so let's think about how we can use events. I've already mentioned many of these, but I wanted to give you guys this to illustrate some of my thought process behind the naming conventions for events, because this is where you can really show your maturity. And again, you spend the most amount of time, and you should, about how this should appear, not just for you, but for your organization, right? When we're thinking of how we track events, it's an open naming convention. You can use a category, action, a label of anything you want. But my process behind how I track something is, first, I think about how a user who knows nothing about Google Analytics, so how my social media, for example, manager, is going to be able to interact and understand what the data is. And if they can't go in and I can't just send them a link to the events report and they can't find and interpret that data, then my naming convention probably isn't right. So I build my naming conventions, and I always kind of put myself in the mindset of, if I'm thinking of someone who doesn't really know how to use Google Analytics, is more a novice, I want to make this as easy as understandable as possible for them to be able to relate with the data. So the first thing you're going to see in my naming conventions is, remember, there's a category, an action, and a label. And kind of Google's recommendation, or the initial thought behind those fields, was a category is a category, an action's an action, and a label is a label of those actions. And you'll see in my naming conventions, I don't always use that. So sometimes my labels will be the actions, and sometimes my actions will be the labels. So you don't have to follow that sort of definition of the events themselves. Instead, just use them as open fields in that hierarchy to best meet your needs. So some examples, and I included links to give you some of the thought process behind some of my naming conventions. So as an example, on my blog post, I released a framework of naming conventions for video tracking. If you were using an enterprise system like MLB BAM or New Lion and trying to track live streaming and video on demand. What's likely though for everyone in this audience is your videos are probably on YouTube, maybe Brightcove, Vimeo. And if that's the case, all you have to do is find a YouTube Google Analytics plugin, and it'll actually do all this work for you. Someone else has already thought of the naming conventions. But in here, I've actually gone through and produced the data layer, the events, all of the custom dimensions, and everything you need for this. But going back to the slides, if we're tracking video, the category should be the least granular item. So a category of video. The action, you can use that as an action: play, pause, rewind, fast forward. And then the label's the video name. So what video was it? Outbound links, category is outbound links. Action is the link, so what link was clicked on. And the label was what page was clicked from. Mail to is exactly the same. So mail to links are any link that opens an email address, whether contacting you or someone else. I kind of recommend if your site has a bunch of mail to links, you really should look at using HubSpot or some other form, Salesforce forms and Sitely. That way you can actually track form submissions and not just submission or kind of contact intent. But if you do have mail to links, you can track those pretty easily, and that's a good naming convention. Login and signups. If your site has registration, I like using a category of login and sign up together, or login and registration. The action can be an action. So in this instance, it can be sign up intent. It can be sign up success. So this is a blog post of mine that actually goes into tracking failed sign up submissions. Most users don't track that, but that's a really important metric, right? How many times are they failing validation? And that's something you should keep an eye on. And then my label here is method. So if you have social auth and then you have regular auth, you can track Facebook versus Twitter versus onsite, etc. And here's examples where I switch my actions. So if we're tracking carousels, as an example, that might be the homepage featured where it's slides, promos. You might have a category of carousels. I like having an action of a carousel name. And the reason is, if I'm tracking a carousel, the next thing I'm going to want to know about that carousel is which carousel was it, right? I'm going to want to be able to define if it's my homepage carousel, if it's in my upsell carousel, any different kind of the carousels across the site. And then the labels, maybe the action. Was it an impression? Was it a click? What was going on with that particular carousel? And it's okay in some of these to concatenate where it makes sense, right? So if I have multiple carousels, then maybe my label is going to be the actual image with a colon of whether it was a click or a view. So you have these three fields, and in certain situations, it's okay to concatenate additional information. And same thing with forms, form name, and form submission. So there's a question here from Daniel. What is the difference between tracking login and signups with events versus tracking it with custom dimensions? So we're going to get into the custom dimensions in a second, but you can't track really a failed form submission with a custom dimension by itself. You need an event to really bring that in. So we'll talk about that in a second, but to answer that question quickly, custom dimensions are associated with a hit, either a page view or an event. So in order to track certain things that happen with that login sign up, remember, page views are just page view interactions. There's other types of things that happen on a page, which you need events for. And that's a perfect example of clicking on the button, right? When you click on that button, that's not a page view, that's a click. So you'll need an event if you're trying to track something on the intent versus maybe the actual validation or success of that. So I included this again, so you guys have some ideas of how I think about the naming conventions behind the events. So I'm gonna try and do a live demo, and it's probably not gonna work, but we'll at least give it a try. So how can we do event tracking in Google Analytics, right? So I'm gonna do this with Google Tag Manager. So I'm gonna switch over here to where I have access. So I'm gonna go into Google Tag Manager. And again, there's other courses and tons of free online training if you need help getting started with GTM. But we're gonna go ahead, we're gonna go into my tag manager. We're gonna use my personal Google Tag Manager account. So we'll go up here, we'll try sign into Tag Manager. So the beauty of Google Tag Manager is, say 4 or 5 years ago when it wasn't available and no one was really using it, if I wanted to track something that was happening on my page, I couldn't do it by myself, right? I'd have to go find a developer, have to have it go through a release cycle. But Google Tag Manager enables me to do this live demo where I'm gonna be able to go in and actually track something that's happening on the page while we're doing it. So there's other questions. Would it be better to track a form submission with a goal of a thank you page with an event or form submission? So that's a great question. I personally, if we think of a form submission, right? So let's take an example. So let's go to our website, Analytics Pros. Now, it's gonna be dependent on your resources and your capabilities, but I'll tell you my preference. So if I have someone go to our contact page, when I'm working with my clients and they're actually investing in analytics and they have a great development team and we're kind of doing the implementation project, I'm always going to track the submissions of these forms with an event. So I'm gonna build a naming convention and I'm gonna instruct the developer to actually fire an event upon the validation of this form. The reason is that actually sends an event as soon as the system has received it. The problem with the page view is there's a little delay and then it eventually redirects to that page view. And there's the other fact that that page view can sometimes be reloaded or sometimes it might be accidentally bookmarked and someone might be going to your thank you page without actually filling out the form. So my preference is to always use an event for form submissions so that upon validation that event's fired. But oftentimes when I'm working with smaller accounts or development resources are constrained, I'll use the page view as the closest approximation. So with that, I would use kind of an event. And if I'm tracking form as a goal, should I still track it as an event? I would, just for that same reason. And you're exactly right, Daniel. That's our data layer inspector, and we'll actually be going over that in a little bit. So back to my failed exercise in Google Tag Manager. We'll give this a try. So I'm gonna go into my GTM account as soon as I can learn how to type my name. So here is the Google Tag Manager account that's on my website. So what I'm gonna do is we're gonna open up an incognito window. And I'm just doing this because something is breaking GTM and I found that out this morning on my site. But let's say there's a request from someone on our team, right? They want to track an interaction that's happening. So here is a post where I was promoting the Conversion XL course. And the request is, we want to know how many people are actually clicking on the call to action to go over to the Conversion XL course and sign up. So we can do that in Google Tag Manager without doing really any development on the website. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna click inspect. And if we go into the console, what's going to happen is if we kind of scroll up, or I just refresh this page as an example, we're gonna see all of this information stream into my console. There's two things that are happening here. One is there's this extension called Data Layer Inspector that was mentioned in the chat. That Data Layer Inspector is actually streaming in all of the requests that are going out to Google Tag Manager with all the information it's receiving. And then also when you see these blobs here, this is a GA debugger, and we'll go over all of these debug tools in a later lecture. But what's important to note here is essentially every time I interact with this page, that information is going to be recorded. So if I click on this link here, if I open up my data layer object, for some reason the extension didn't pick it up. So if I just open up the object down here, we're going to start seeing all of these clicks and other information that actually happen. So let me actually go into the post. Let's see if this works. All right, so what we're going to try and do here is we're going to try and actually track the click on this link in Google Tag Manager and fire an event on it. So I'm going to grab the URL of the post, and you can see all the scroll tracking and everything that's being pushed down there. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go back into Google Tag Manager, and we're going to create an event together. I'll show you how easy it is. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my new tag. We're going to select a universal analytics tag. Always use the new Google Analytics code, not classic. It's going to ask us for what type of track type do we want. So these are the hit types, essentially. We're going to select an event. We'll put in a tracking code. So for now, I'll just put in a random ID. And here's where it's going to ask us for the category, action, and label. So I'm just going to make something up. This is not a good naming convention, but we'll call this call to action. We'll call this conversion, XL, course. And then for my label, maybe I'll put in a definition of the page URL as an example. Now, that's the event itself. The real magic of Google Tag Manager comes in on the triggers. So for the triggers, we're going to create a trigger. And what you're going to see here is we actually have an option of tracking clicks with Google Tag Manager out of the box. So for this, we're going to track a link click because that's a link. So I'm going to say I want this tag to fire on some clicks, and I'm going to say I want this to fire on a click URL of that conversion XL. So what's happening is Google Tag Manager out of the box is tracking a lot of information in the click. So the element name, the element class, the URL, and this click URL should fire this tag. So if I, for example, give this trigger a name, and we call this conversion XL link click, what should happen is Google Tag Manager is going to enable a link click listener on that page, and it's going to fire this event anytime that's clicked on. So we'll call this conversion XL click. And again, this is horrible naming conventions, so don't use this. And instead, make sure you actually attend the GTM course. Okay, so what should happen now is if I preview my container, so we'll click preview. What's happened now is Google Tag Manager is loading this new configuration locally on my machine, so I can test and interact with the data that's actually happening. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab this link over here. So I'll click Share Preview. And I could send this link to anyone to also do testing. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to start a new incognito window. I'm going to throw in that URL. And now when I visit my website, Google Tag Manager is going to load in debug mode. So it should open up a debug window at the bottom and show me all of the tags that are firing and that are available on that page. And here it is. So far, so good. So this was on the page load. We can see a summary of all the tags in the container. And we can see all the tags that were fired on this page. So I got some universal analytics. I have some magnetic. I have some GA events, ad roll. And then as I interact with the page and the site, everything is tracked on the left-hand side with everything that's occurring. So Carlos asked, would I recommend using segment.io to replace so many tags? So this is personal preference, but I don't like segment. The reason I don't like segment is it doesn't actually work with universal analytics and especially enhanced e-commerce nicely. So what ends up happening is many of my clients who use segment end up injecting Google Tag Manager in segment. So they're running a tag management system in a tag management system, which defeats the whole purpose. So what ends up happening in segment is you run just as many tags anyways. So Google Tag Manager, if Google Analytics is your primary analytics system, usually ends up being the best system. If we talked about more enterprise use cases, I also really love Telium. So those are my two favorites. But going back to this example, the objective here was to track this link here. So what I'm going to do also is I'm going to open up my other debug console. So now we're running two debug consoles. And we should see on this, now that I'm in my debug mode and I've turned on that link click listener, that every click that I trigger is actually tracked. And you can see that here. And here's all the element information. Now, what should happen is you can see here, when I click on any of those clicks, it didn't actually do anything in Google Tag Manager. Nothing fired. But if I scroll down and I actually click this conversion XL, we can see what happened. It fired an event. It looks like it fired a scroll tracking event. And if we go over here, we can see that the tags fired. It did not fire my particular event because I made some particular mistake. But I'm not going to figure that out now. But you can actually go into here, and what's nice is you can actually debug it. So if I look at my filters, I can see that the click URL did not contain this because it also did not contain a link click, etc. So this didn't fire because it didn't enable my link click listener. Instead, it fired on the click. So that was my mistake. But with this, you can see how easy it is for you to actually go in, create an event, and also debug the mistakes that I've made, and then easily see here what you needed to do to fix this. But the purpose of this exercise, in addition to showing you why to never do live demos, was really to show you, if you're using Google Tag Manager, how easy it is for you with a little bit of training to actually go in and fire your own events. So that's going to be how you, as an intermediate or advanced user, are going to do a lot with Google Tag Manager. You can fire events on clicks, link clicks. You can use the data layer when you're working with your developers. And also, if you're trying to track any of these things in this list, if you just search video tracking, Google Analytics, YouTube integration for Google Analytics, outbound links for Google Analytics, Lunametrics, CMO, or someone already has something you can actually just put in Google Tag Manager, and it'll just turn it on for you with all the naming conventions configured. So I highly encourage you to spend a lot of time thinking about what events and you should use for your website. All right, so that's pretty much it for how to send events. Events are so important with Google Analytics. If we go into Google Analytics for a second, so let's go into our audience overview. So again, this is the Google Merchandise Store. All of the events that you're tracking will be in the behaviors section. So there's events, there's topics. This is where I go every single time. Don't really use any of the other events reports. And here, the first thing you have is your categories, right? So you have your categories. At the top, you can change it to your actions or labels. But when you're thinking about your average user of Google Analytics, this is how they come in. They go to top events, then they click on an event category, such as depth. And then the action, you're going to think, what should they see next, right? So Google set theirs up to have an action of a percentage. I actually don't like this at all. My action, I would want to be the page. And then once they click on which page, so are they trying to, for example, figure out scroll tracking on a particular blog page, then it would show the label of the percentage that was scrolled. I think percentage is a wasted attribute when they could have filled it with something different. But anyways, it shows you the category, action, and label in the hierarchy. And if you go back, when you drill into a category, and what's really nice is the breadcrumbs at the top of the report. So you always know what you're looking at. And you can always come in and, for example, have a category of scroll depth. Instead, look at an event label. So I could look, for example, at the baseline. And then if the action was my pages, I would be able to see a percentage and see the 25% by every single page and see what was scrolled on. So these events, you can use them heavily in the events reports, but as now an intermediate user who's gone through my first 2 lectures, these events are gonna get the most value for you as an analyst when you use them in advanced segments. So you can, for example, create a segment of traffic for anyone who's scrolled more than 50% of a page and compare that to scrolled less. Or videos. What is the relationship of users who watch a video to converting versus users who don't watch a video to converting? So using your advanced segments, you can create audiences of users who triggered an event versus who didn't trigger an event. You can create sequences. You can say, show me an audience of users who landed on the homepage, then clicked the carousel, and then added something to the cart in that order. So now you can actually do padding with your events. And then goals. So you also have the ability to set up goals with your events as well. So goals can be based off of page views, events, or engagement. So like on the site for more than 5 minutes. So I don't know if we covered this before, but what's the difference in the events reports versus a goal that's been set up as an event? So let's see in the chat if everyone can answer this question. So let's say I set up a goal for playing a video. So I would go into the admin. So if I switched my view where I had admin access, let's say we set up a new goal, and we're gonna set up a goal for anyone who plays a video on our website. So we'd set that up by going to admin, we'd go into the goals, we'd trigger a new goal, and then we'd select an event. So we'll say this is an event. We'll say this is a video play. We'll go to continue, and then in here we set a category action label. So we'll say video and the action is play. Now, if I'm a user and I come to the site and I watch 5 videos and I go back to that goals report, how many goals are recorded? Is it 5? Is it 1? What do you guys think? So we have different answers. Are 5 and we have 1. So this is one thing that's really important for you to know. Goals only increment once per session. So what that means is the event's going to be recorded 5 times in the report. Or if you were tracking page views and you set up a page view goals, the page views is recorded 5 times, but the goal only ever increments per session. You shouldn't be using goals for how many times things happened. You're using goals as really a conversion type metric to really be able to use in the rest of GA to determine a percentage that happens of your sessions, right? So what's the percentage of users that came from Facebook who converted? So you need to use a goal to do that. So goals only ever increment once per session. It's really important to know. Events, those will be counted every single time they occur. So what is the difference between goals and unique events? So goals and unique events, when you're using those, should be roughly the same, but unique events are calculated. So if we go back to the events report, we'll see some new metrics. So we have a total events, and to confuse you further, if in the Google Analytics blog, there's also a new dimension called unique dimension combinations, which you can only right now use in custom reports, so UDC. So total events are the total, how many times the event happened. Unique events should be the event happened per session, right? So AutoSense happened 177,000 times, but in reality happened 40,000 times per session. I'm not going to try and go over this now because this is more of an advanced topic and I'm just going to confuse you. But the unique events isn't exactly once per session. there's a way the action and label rolls up in the new UDC, which is unique dimension combinations, is the best way to track the uniqueness per session. Your unique events is somewhere in between that. And if you're confused, I'll send you some blog posts after. But your unique events and your unique goals are going to be roughly the same. So we can use our events in our event segments. We can use them in our goals. But really, the audiences and the event segments and your custom reports and data studio is going to be where you're going to get the most value out of those. Okay, so that's really everything you need to know about events. The main takeaway is events. You need to use those to measure interactions. And that's going to take to our custom dimensions. So custom dimensions are really where you're going to get a lot of value around different ways to segment your audiences and then use those segments in a variety of places in GA. So a definition, again, copied and pasted directly from the Google support. I didn't have a fun definition I came up with. But really what you want to take a look at is custom dimensions are a way we can track attributes of our users, our sessions, and the hits that we're tracking about our users. So as an example, if we think about a user, and I wanted to track users that were registered versus non-registered, it doesn't really make sense to use an event for that. It makes more sense for that to be an attribute of the user or the session. If I'm tracking, for example, something about a session, right? Maybe I want to know which sessions had a login and which sessions didn't have a login. Custom dimensions allow us, when we use a session scope, to track that per session. And then there's also these hit scope segments or hit scoped dimensions. So let's think of an event or a page, right? When I'm tracking pages, there's all sorts of other information available about that page. So if we think about my blog post as an example, there's an author, there's a publish date, there's content categories, there's all this metadata about the page, which Google Analytics doesn't track by default. So that page or that author changes per page. So we'd use a hit scoped dimension to track author and get the value of that author on every single page. And we could use that on the page itself, which is nice. And then, for example, videos. Maybe your videos have a category. What category is the video? Is it a sales video? Is it a promo? Is it a product video? Instead of concatenating everything into your action, which was the old way people would do things in GA, custom dimensions allow you to have multiple attributes of that event in addition to the category, action, and label. So let's go into some specifics and it'll start to make more sense. So first, how do we send custom dimensions? So there's a dev guide in here as well that you guys can use to follow this along. But like events, dimensions are a little bit similar in the value, and there's a name, and you can use that however you want. So our dimension name, we're going to set that up in Google Analytics, and I'll show you guys that in a second. There's an index number, so slots 1 through 20 if you're on the free version of Google Analytics. So in the free version, you have 20 dimensions, you have 20 metrics, and I think I might be wrong on this. I also have 20 calculated metrics as well. But you definitely have 20 dimensions and 20 metrics. And I'll tell you the limit on calc in a minute. Those limits are per property. So they're shared by all of the views in that property. And each additional property gets 20 more. The paid version has 200 dimensions, 200 metrics, and I think 50 metrics. So the way we send these custom dimensions, simply all you need to know is you attach them to a hit that you're tracking in Google Analytics. So I'll show you kind of that. And so first thing, let's go into Google Analytics and let's look at a custom dimension setup. So in the admin, I'll show you where you find these. Custom dimensions are at the bottom in the property settings, so account property view, under custom definitions. So in definitions, you can find your custom dimensions. And if you have admin access, you can create and change these. So in here, you can see that we have 8 custom dimensions. So this is a premium account. I have more than 20. You can see some examples of custom dimensions we've set up. I'll show you some of those in a minute. But creating a custom dimension is pretty simple. You just go in, you click new custom dimension, you give it a name, such as test. You give it a scope. So here, scopes. So just like events, when you have to think about your naming conventions, you need to think about the scopes, what you name, and what the values of your custom dimensions are. So we have hit, session, user, and product. So let's talk about those real quickly. First, let's talk about a hit scope segment. So you would use a hit scoped custom dimension when you want to track something that changes in between interactions, right? So author is a perfect example. The author is going to change on every single page, and I want to know the exact value of that author. So anything that's changing per hit, either event or page, you're going to want to use a hit scope segment to track that. So author, content category, those are good examples of hit scoped custom dimensions. Then we have session and user. So let's start with a session scoped custom dimension. The session scoped custom dimension works is when you hit that to the entire session, also known as the visit. So before, during, and after that hit. So what that means is, as an example, if I go to a client, so maybe I'll go to World Surf League, the NFL of surfing. So World Surf League has a login and registration option. So you can go here, you can click sign in or sign up. And when the user successfully does that, we probably want to send an event upon validation, right? So upon validation, if they followed my blog, which they did because I implemented the analytics on the site, they're going to send an event that indicates whether the user successfully registered or not. When they send that event, what we can do is if we use a segment, that value will apply all the way back to the beginning of the visit and stay with it all the way to the end. What that means is back over in Google Analytics, we're going to be able to use that value anywhere for anything in that visit. The other is user. The way user works is the same as session, meaning it applies back to the beginning of the visit, and it also will apply to future visits as well. So what that means, if I'm World Surf League, is when that user registers, I can send an additional piece of data. So maybe I want to track the user's user ID so that I can join it with my other data sets. So when that user registers, I'm going to grab their user ID from the cookie, or maybe my developer passed it along, and maybe it's user 1234. So what I can do is I can pass it along with the event. So my event category is registration, my event action is success, the event label is Facebook because they use Facebook to register, and then the custom dimension user ID with 1234. So if I pass that along, what happens is in a user scope segment, that ID will go back all the way to the beginning of the visit, even though they weren't logged in. And the next time they come back, as long as they have the same cookies, he will stay with that user, and I'll be able to continue to use that for future visits. Important thing to note about user segments is it does not apply to previous sessions. It only applies to the and future. So it won't go back in time previously. The last scope is product, and we'll use this for enhanced e-commerce. But if we're tracking product impressions, add to carts, we can track and scope it to particular products as well. So the custom dimensions you're going to use the most are going to be year and hit. Session is used pretty infrequently. So if I like author, I simply go in, I select author, give it a scope, I hit save, and then what's going to happen is, for example, if we search for author, it's going to assign an index to it. So maybe index 25. The scope is hit, and there's a change date. So go in here, it says I just said. It's going to give you examples of how to fire this. So you should be doing it this way. You're going to go into Google Tag Manager, and I'll show you exactly how easy that is. So go back into Google Tag Manager, and we find our conversion XL. So here's our link click that we just set up. So what I can do is actually go in, and if I go into the tag itself, so I need to go into the tags. We can add a custom dimension to the event. So if we just pretended that this was a registration event, and we track this on successful registration, I can go into my tag settings, and then I can go into the more settings, and here's your custom dimensions and metrics. So you simply give it an index name. So I'll say, for example, index 25, the dimension value. So if it was registration, maybe you just say registered user. Or you would grab a dynamic variable if you're using the data layer, or grab it from the cookie, which is also when you create these, and you put in a dynamic variable of the user ID, doing something like that. So pretty simple to use these custom dimensions. They're simply an additional data type that you attach with your page view or in your event most commonly. So let's go back to the slides. I also put together some examples of custom dimensions that are popular to use. So common custom dimensions. Anytime you have a blog, you're going to use author. It's really important, and we're going to do that at the end when we kind of put it all together. It allows me to create reports that I can share with my content creators about how popular their content is. And for all of my clients, I like to use that as an opportunity for them to buy creating content, right? Make it a competition. Have a report that's shown somewhere in your office around which post by which author had the most views, monthly, weekly, all time, so that when people are writing, they're always trying to become the new most popular content article ever written about. You can also use those for meta tags. So for SEO purposes, maybe you want to track meta keywords. So you can easily track which pages don't have meta keywords set, which ones do, kind of any meta tags that you might have set up. There's the registration custom dimension. You can do custom segments from your CRM, right? If you do some sort of segmentation, maybe you have qualified, unqualified, maybe you have customers, non-customers, you can track those from your CRM. User IDs, great way to using custom dimension. What I do, and most people don't do it this way, but I recommend tracking a user ID in two separate custom dimensions, one hit scoped and one user scoped. The reason why is the user scope segment is obvious, right? Once you have that ID, you want it available everywhere. But what's important to know about custom dimensions and how they work, if we go back, is when you use a session or a user scope dimension, the last value wins. Meaning in a user scope dimension, the value that's recorded in a session applies to the entire session. So if you had a user who logged in twice as two different accounts, the second login is going to replace the first for that session all the way back to the beginning of the visit. So remember, user scope segments only apply to the beginning of the visit and future. It never updates past visits. So it wouldn't go back and update the past visits, but it would update anything that happened in that session. So to track users that are logging in more times, if you have a hit scope segment, you can do that sort of analysis. If you only had user scoped, it would actually be overriding it, and you wouldn't be able to know that. So there was a question about Ahmed about custom dimensions for products. So product availability, product color, those are great examples for using product scope custom dimensions, tracking things that aren't SKUs or product names. And then raw URL. So we'll talk about this in another lecture, but it's a best practice to really add filters to your views to clean up your URLs. So by default, Google Analytics tracks pages as two different URLs. If you use filters to strip off the query parameters, you can still capture that raw URL with the query parameters in a custom dimension, which is nice. So that was some common custom dimensions. Again, if you just search author for Google Analytics, how blog posts from CMO to tell you exactly how to do this for anything you need. So I'm not gonna try and be CMO, so just Google CMO and he'll have examples of everything you need to add this with your implementation of GA. So there's a quick question, is there a way of tracking the user ID between different devices with different cookies? So well, I think we'll talk about that in another lecture with cross-device tracking, but by default, that's gonna track separately on using ID view, which we'll talk about in a future lecture. The index, Amanda, is simply a slot number. So when it said 45, if we were to go back into GA, those index is the slot number, and it's what Google Analytics uses to receive that information. So I have no idea where my Google Analytics window went, but it's in here, right? So if we go back to cancel, the index is simply the slot number. So that's what you use to define what's receiving it, because this custom dimension name is only in GA. You put the dimension name on your website or in Google Tag Manager. Instead, you use the index to make sure you're feeding it to the right slot and value. All right. So with that, let's see what we had up next. So those were the scopes, user hit, session, product. We went through the live setup. So the next thing we wanted to talk about quickly was custom metrics. So custom metrics are simply counters. You can think of this as a counter. How many times did something happen, right? So the old way when we were using classic analytics is we'd always use total events to track how many times something happened. But what custom metrics allow us to do is to actually go in and name something and count it. So I'll show you what that means. But first, the scopes. When we set up a metric, there's only two scopes. There's either hit or product. We'll talk about product later. Mostly you'll always use hit because it's simply a counter of how many times something happened. So why do custom metrics exist and why do we use them? So let's think of an example of tracking video plays, right? If we wanted to track video plays, as I recommended, you'd set up an event and you'd have an event of or a category of video, an action of play, and a label of video name. And if someone wanted to track how many times that video was played, they'd click on video. They'd see an event action of play and use an event label. So play, I can see that there were 67 plays, and I can see this by video. So this particular video was watched 66 times. Now, one of the things that was really frustrating for users when they were building reports is if you were to build a dashboard, as an example, there's no way to have a metric called video play. So everything in your dashboard would end up being it would end up like this. So you'd have a table, and our dimension, for example, would be event label, and the metric would be total events. And then we'd add these filters, right? So we'd filter it for an event category contains video. So just pretend I did that. And then this would be the report that's shown, right? They'd have an event label, and the event label say video name. That would be the name of the video, and have total events. The problem is, our average beginner user of Google Analytics doesn't know what an event label is, and they don't know what a total event is. And there's no way in these dashboards or in Google Analytics to change it to just say video plays, which would be much more intuitive for people to interact and understand that data. So what custom metrics allow us to do is we can come in and we can simply create metrics, apply to the event, right? So I can come and say, let's create a custom metric. And we can call video plays. If I can name it, we can see we have different types, integers, currency, and time. So you'd use an integer for this. And then you'd simply click create. And then all you do in Google Tag Manager, kind of show you, is you go into your metric, you use index number. So if this put it in index 10, what you have to do is put a metric of 1. And every time this event is fired, it's going to pass a value of 1 for that video play. And what this does in Google Analytics is it's going to be identical to the total events for that video play, but it makes it easier for me as an analyst and for my end user, because now I'm going to have a custom metric associated where it's actually called video plays. So let's put this all together. So let's assume that you've created these custom dimension metrics. And I promised I'd show you that WordPress plugin. So there's a free plugin for Google Tag Manager. Let's see if I typed it right. Called, I think it's Duracell, and I'm sure I typed it wrong. But it takes you 3 minutes for you to go in and implement this. And what it's going to do is it's going to inject Google Tag Manager on the site. And it's also going to configure a data layer for you. So the beauty of it is you don't even have to know how to configure a data layer, because this plugin is going to do most of it for you, especially for blogs. So if I go in and we inspect our website, so this is a blog post, answer 5 attribution questions with Google Analytics. If I go into my console and I just type in data layer, this plugin has actually created a data layer object for me. And let's see what's in here. Look at this data. So this plugin actually created a data layer object and actually dynamically put in the author, the publish date. They put in the title, the type of post it was. There's an integration to even pass in the word of where the user's at, so you can actually pass in weather data. All of this is passed in plugin in the data layer itself. And all you do is go to Google Tag Manager, following Simo's advice, and pick up this data attribute. And in 5 minutes, I dynamically have all the information being passed in from my website into Google Tag Manager. So if I go in Analytics, what I should be able to do is go into my website. I can find it. So here's my blog. You guys can see all the money I rake in now. So I can go to a report, for example, behavior. I can go to site content. And I can go into all pages. So once I have these custom dimensions, they're really easy to use in GA. All I have to do is, using secondary dimensions, you have a drop-down of all the custom dimensions, and you can see I've set up some for some of the information from that. And if I grab the paper or any of that weather data, what it's going to do is now it's going to Y custom dimension as an attribute of that page. So now I can see the author associated with easily search or drill for a particular person. So now that I have those custom dimensions set up, I can use those as segments. I can use those in custom reports. I can grab them from the API, and I can easily add them to any report in GA to filter and identify different things that are happening. So those custom dimensions are really important, because using this, now you can easily segment all the information for your page and grab a certain attribute that you care about. So for those events, David, you also use those as pages. So with that weather or that page information, I can track on every page what the author was. So author would be a great use of using a page hit to track and widen that in here. So that's how we bring in our custom dimensions. That's how we report on those. And that's how we use those. So with this, we also had the custom metrics. You'll notice that in the dropdown, there's no custom metrics available. That's because these are dimensions, and a metric is a metric. So your custom metrics that you set up are only going to be available in your dashboards. They'll be available in your reports as well, so in your custom report. And they'll also be available in API and in your advanced segments that you're creating. But you'll simply come in and you can create a metric, and whatever you named your metric, it'll be available. And I don't know if I have any set up off the top of my head, but any metrics you set up will be important and be available and accessible directly here. Pretty easy. Now, the main use case for custom metrics gets into the next one. The only time I really ever create custom metrics is because I want to use those in calculated metrics. So let's talk about calculated metrics real quickly, and then we'll wrap this all up together and move into Q&A. So I gave an example here of 25 calculated metrics that you guys can take a look at or to use. But what calculated metrics essentially allow us to do is create metrics that don't exist into GA. So as an example, let's go into our audience overview report, and let's talk about some of the data we receive. So let's talk about one of my biggest complaints about GA. Google Analytics has promoted itself as a user-centric platform for, I think, about 3 years since Analytics came along. If you look at any report in GA, so let's go to geolocation, you'll quickly find that users isn't really available anywhere except these overview report we looked at before. Now this is gonna change soon. Google's gonna be actually adding users everywhere. But in the meantime, if I wanted to ask a question for your website, what was the average amount of pages per user? Or average user duration? I don't care about how much time spent in a particular visit. I want to know how much time they spent with my brand or my website across any given day. How would you calculate that, right? How would we get that metric? You really can't. There's no easy way to do that. But what we can do with calculated metrics is we can create and actually use that in a matter of seconds. So if you want to follow along, your calculated metrics will be available in the admin section. And the calculated metrics are available per view. So they're not available per property. Google fixed that. It used to be per property, now they're per view. So if you have filters or other settings, the calculated metrics will take those into account. You'll create calculated metrics by coming in and just clicking the new button. So we can call this, for example, average user duration. You pick a formatting type. So we have floats, integers, currency, time, and they also have percentages now. We're gonna use time. And for this, you'll see how easy it is. You just search for session duration, and we'll divide this by users. So we're not gonna have to do the exercise today. So I recommend you try this because this was the exercise. But it's this simple. Session divided by users, we'll click create. So I've already used this, so I'll just call this demo. And no spaces. The calc metric name here, the external name, is for the API. I don't really have to worry about that too much. But you can see I've created the same metric I already created before. But let's create a new one. So I also asked about what's the average amount of pages per user. So I can come into here. I can create, for example, a float or an integer. So I'll use a float. We'll call this pages per user. And I'll divide page views by users. Done. There's my metric. Now I mentioned that one of the main use cases for custom metrics was calculated metrics. So the why custom metrics are so important is if you wanted to create ratios, like what's the average amount of plays or video interactions user, or what's the average amount, for example, of contact requests per user or blog views per user. You can't do that easily with events. The only easy way to do that is with custom metrics. So if you have a custom metric set up, you can come in and create your own ratios. So for example, registration success or contact success or form validation, you can actually create the ratios of what the submissions versus completions are, actually see what that ratio is, and create an alert intelligence event to tell you anytime that actually, for example, rises above 50%, something that's concerning to you, and Google will actually email you off of the calculated metric, off of that custom metric. So this is why calculated metrics for me are a huge addition to GA and something all the time. So how can we use those? And we can't use the calculated metrics anywhere in the reports, but we can use these in our custom reports as well as the dashboards and any of the APIs that you're using as well. So let's create a custom report together. So what happened here is I should now be able to create a report. So for example, I should be able to create something like show me what my average user duration and what my pages per user are. And I can call metric demo. And let's hit save. So this is the beauty of it. What you saw just happen now doesn't usually happen in GA. But what happened is the data is retroactive. So it applied historically to all of the data collected. And what's nice is you can create these calculated metrics and also go into data and you can update them as well. So if you made a mistake, and for example, you should have used an integer instead of a float, you metric and change it, and it'll recalculate it history. So you can play with these you want. But now what I can see is to see per country, which countries have the highest. And I want to add my users probably as the primary column, so I can actually see how many users are in each bucket. Now I can see my engagement at a user level broken out by country. And the same thing applies for all those ratios. You can apply those to any sort of dimension or metric. But the real value, I think, of your custom metrics come in your Data Studio, Tableau, or Google Sheets or something. You're building a dashboard or a report of it. Calculated metrics, super easy to use and super powerful when you combine that with your custom metrics as well. So what we want to do now is I want to show you an example of kind of bringing this all together and how it really gets so fun to me. So we're going to do a sneak peek of our Data Studio lecture that we have coming up in just a few weeks. I think it might be next. But just coming through this while it loads, Studio, now a free unlimited reporting tool that is, it's Google's version of Tableau. So what I'm going to do is show you how easy it is to create a curated experience with those custom dimensions that we're using. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the data source, close chat for a second. So I'm going to create a new data source. I'm going to select Google Analytics. I'm going to select this Google merchant, or I'm going to select this publisher, the online behavior account. I'm going to connect. And now what I can do is I can start creating a report and share this with everyone in my organization. So what I can do now, data on the canvas. So if I wanted to create a gamified content creation as an example, what I can do is I can come in, I can draw a table, and I can change the dimension. So I can change this to our author. So I'm going to come in, I'm going to search for my author. So this is a custom dimension that's been set up. And right here, I can see which authors had the most amount of sessions. And the beauty of using that custom dimension is it actually says it's an author. It's not something nondescript like event name or page name or something else. It's what it is and how many times it happened. And I can come in, I can draw a date range, and I have a simple report right here where now any user can in and be able to select a particular report and see exactly what they want. So I can turn this to view mode. The user can now come in, select a particular date, hit apply, and the canvas will update for exactly the date range that they're interested in with just the author and the sessions. And if I had a custom metric, for example, I could say, for example, content, or I could call it instead of having it just be generic name like this. So that's how we kind of pull it all together. So those custom dimensions, custom metrics, and calculated metrics really give you a lot of control over visualizing all that data in and surfacing it how you want. So for every account that I work with, I'm setting up between 5 to 10 custom dimensions. It's not something you need to go and fill out all 20. You really never should, because you never need to. But definitely use those for ones that are most important to the business working with. Another kind of closing remark about events. I have kind of a philosophy of not over tracking things. So it might be tempting to come in and to track every single thing happening on your site, right? You could, if you want, you could track every click, you could track every click, you could track every scroll, hover, you could track everything that's happening. I personally subscribe to the philosophy of being more specific and only tracking what's important and what's useful for your particular business. So I'll track the micro, macro conversions. I'll track maybe things that I think might be important in the future, but I rarely will ever come in and track everything because I personally think it adds too much bloat to everything going on. And one that's really important to end with is going back to, so if we go back to the slides, when we talk about our events, one thing that I would add here is there's also a setting of non-interaction. So when we're tracking events, there's a flag which you can use to track the interaction. And it's basically for false or 0 or 1. So every time you track an event in Google Analytics, you're going to have an ability to and determine whether this is a non-interactive hit or it is. And this is really important for you to think through. And when I'm doing my audits, it's one of the things that I see implemented most incorrectly. So what the interaction event does is you're telling Google Analytics whether this event should update the bounce rate. So if it's set false, which is the default setting of an event, you leave this off or don't configure it at all, then it's going to be interactive by default. And what that means is every time that event occurs, it updates the time and it updates the if it's selected. What that means tracking or a carousel which auto hovers and you leave it as false, what you've just is you've turned your bounce rate to 0%, and you've likely also turned your time on site and your session duration small or very large numbers. So it's very important to be very thoughtful around when you want to the time and when you want to update the bounce rate, right? Maybe it doesn't make sense for a video play to have that bounce anymore, unless video is really important and that's what you are using maybe as a publisher to drive ad revenue. Then in that case, we're going to leave that as an interactive event. So when I'm using events, you're going to want to think through interactive and when they're non-interactive. In general, you use non-interactive anytime it's something that happens page load or without the user triggering it. So anything that's happening like the scrolling, the video percentages, like those are usually good uses of non-interactive hits. So with that, kind of wraps up everything that I think you guys need to know around events, custom dimensions, custom metrics, calculated metrics. This lecture was all about moving beyond page views, in the custom that's happening about your users, your sections, your pages, all that types of interactions. So if you need to drop off, our next lecture is going to be on 4/10. So remember, we're taking off Wednesday for the Conversion XL conference. We'll be talking all about content performance. I'll be going deeper into scroll tracking, different ways to analyze content, do pathing. Should be a fun time. So with that, let's move over to Q&A and see what we have here. So there was a question to setting up GTM parameters for custom dimensions for author. So this one's going to be more technical. I don't know if I can go into your specific scenario. Definitely just Google Simo author because he's going to have a tutorial on how to do it. But if I were doing it on my own website and you're using that kind of Duracell plugin, I'll give you kind of a quick example by showing you. So let me go into Google Tag Manager. Let's go into our tag. So let me close this. So if I go to my core page view tag, it's one of these. The question is, now that I have 3, which one is it? Let's try this one first. You can see I do far too many demos in my own account. So we'll just use this as an example. So in this one, it's tracking the weather, and the weather is a variable. So the beauty of my website is that in that data layer object, saw there was a job of author, weather, content category, all that information which was in that console. So once you've turned on the plugin, all you have to do in Google Tag Manager is step one, you create your custom dimension in Google Analytics. So when you create your custom definition, you're gonna give it a name. So for example, weather, and then it's automatically gonna give you the index number. So you're gonna take the index number from Google Analytics, you're gonna put it in Google Tag Manager, and then you need to give it the value. So what's the value of the weather? So you either can hard code a value in, so I could say sunny, and then it's gonna say sunny on every single page. Or in Google Tag Manager, you can configure these variables with your Lego. So you click the plus button, and what I do is I would select a data layer variable by clicking the plus button. So again, this is gonna require a whole training on how to use Google Tag Manager appropriately. But you come in here, you say it's a data layer variable in the variable type. And then all you have to do is you say the name of the data layer variable. So if I go back to my site, the data layer variable name is in the blob. So it was, if I go inspect, go to console, put data layer or use my extension. Here's the objects. The data layer name, for example, is page, post type, weather, temp, weather degree, and I'd simply put that in here, and then I hit save, and now when that tag fires, it pulls that information from the variable, my custom dimension is set, and I'm all good. And if you're not a developer, or you shouldn't really be using Google Tag Manager or installing plugins, then you'll just work with your developer to help do this process, and you'll be all set. So that's how we use Google Tag Manager. So there's another question of what happens if the calculated metric reports an error, example 1 divided by 0. I don't know the answer, but I'm pretty sure it just doesn't record. I encourage you to try dividing 1 divided by 0 in your own calculated metric, and then let us know what happens. But I don't know the answer off the top of my head. How, if all, can one use percentiles for a specific metric? So that one's an interesting question. If we're thinking about maybe scroll tracking, where we're tracking 25, 50, 700, normally you just use that as an event, use a custom metric for that. If you wanted to track a percentile and you wanted to use a calculated metric, you'd want to do is maybe have one metric for, you'd have one custom metric which counts how many times happen, right? So if we're tracking scroll, then you'll have one custom metric which increments on each scroll. So scroll 1, scroll 2, scroll 3, scroll, but sums all the scrolling. And then maybe you'll have, and you divide that by either sins or zers, and it would build your percentile kind of off of that, as long as you set the metric type to percentage. So maybe that would be a good example. There was a question of, do you have a list or reference for the most recommended custom dimensions and metrics for e-commerce? That, Daniel, after. I'll see if I can find that for you. I don't the top of, but I guarantee Lunametrics has a post on that. Usually the custom dimensions for e-commerce are product attributes. So you'll have product category, product color, you'll have in stock, out of stock. Maybe you'll use metrics to track the margin. Maybe you'll use it to track discounts, use it to calculate custom revenue calculations. So revenue with shipping, revenue without shipping, taxes, no taxes. So those are good uses of metrics for e-commerce. All right, I think that's all of the questions. Anything else? Otherwise, hopefully you guys will all be spending a lot of time with CMO, or again, my colleague Jacob has another great class on Google Tag Manager. And I think Conversion XL has another live GTM training coming up as well, which would be really great for you guys to get into. As was mentioned in chat, CMO is CMO. You need to know CMO to really be able to do everything in GA. He's got great stuff in here. All right, with that, I look forward to seeing you guys all on Monday to go over content. Definitely thank you guys all for, and hopefully you guys have a great week. Cheers.